Eurasian Studies, running the Center's program on Central Asia. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion of the book, Bridging State and Civil Society, Informal Organizations in Tajik, Afghan, Badakhshan, by Dr. Suzanne Levi-Sanchez, that has just been published by University of Michigan Press. This is one of those books that couldn't be written in a year or two. It draws on decades of research and thinking, years in the field in a very challenging environment of Tajik and Afghan Badakhshan. And we will put a flyer with a discount code in the chat so you can use it if you decide to purchase it. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. We're very happy to have the author of the book with us, Dr. Levi-Sanchez, who is a non-resident fellow at American University School of International Service and a retired tenured associate professor of National Security Affairs Department at the US Naval War College. She's the author of a number of publications, including The Afghan Central Asia Borderlands, the State and Local Leaders, published by Routledge in 2017. Today we'll be discussing her second book, Bridging State and Civil Society, that has just been published by University of Michigan Press, as I mentioned already. She is also the author of the forthcoming book, Fieldwork as Craft, a practical guide to doing research in the real world. Welcome, Susie. We're also very happy to have with us Dr. Jennifer Murtazashvili, who is joining us from Tbilisi, Georgia. And she is the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets and associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on issues of self-governance, security, political economy, and public sector reform in the developing world. She's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Murtazashvili is the author of a number of books, Informal Order and the State of Afghanistan, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, and the new book, Land, the State and War, Property, Institutions and Political Order in Afghanistan, authored with Ilya Murtazashvili, published by Cambridge University Press just last year. It's great to have you with us, Chad. Last but not least, we have Ambassador Robert Finn with us. He's a former lecturer on Turkish literature at Princeton University's Department of Near Eastern Studies and Ertegun Professor of Turkic Studies. His distinguished foreign service career includes posts at US missions in Turkey and as ambassador to Tajikistan from 1998 till 2001 and ambassador to Afghanistan in 2002-2004. He's a polyglot. His languages include Turkish, Azerbaijani, Urdu, Tajik, Persian, French, German, and Ottoman. Ambassador Finn's publications include a book, The Early Turkish Novel, 1872-1900, and poems, articles, and translations in English and Turkish. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So without further ado, let's go to you, Susie.
Thank you so much, Nargez, for the lovely introduction. I'm honored to be here today. And both Jennifer and Robert, Ambassador Finn and Dr. Murtazashvili have mentored me and supported me. And I'm a little nervous about what they have to say afterwards, but I'm really grateful that everybody's here. My mother, who passed away a number of years ago, is probably smiling down from heaven, seeing that I'm here today. So I'm quite grateful. So now I'm going to share my screen. Also, I have post-COVID and I've been struggling with recall sometimes, but I'm going to try to do this off book. So I apologize in advance for any anything I forget. All right, let's see if this works. Here we go. All right. So today I'm just going to briefly give an overview, sort of touch points of my book. First, I'll give you a little background. Then I'm going to go into the conceptual framework and the main concepts. Then I'll discuss the case studies a little bit and go into a couple of them, provide some final thoughts, and that's about it. And if I can get this to work. Click on here. All right. So these two pictures are photographs I took from different trips in the helicopter between Dushanbe and Khorog, Tajikistan. Usually I went into Afghanistan from either the city of Khorog, or which is on the Tajik side, or from Ishkashim, Tajikistan. These two pictures show the river valleys that most of the people live in the region, and the high mountains. It is a difficult to get to area. It's extremely cold, and there's only about 3% arable land. There are 11 distinct languages in these river valleys, and it's primarily inhabited by the Pamiri Ismailis, and has been for a very long time. It's an unbelievably beautiful area as well. This is a map of the territory that I primarily worked in. If you look at, this is Badakhshan, this is Badakhshan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and then you can see the neighborhood that the countries are in. Tajikistan, Afghanistan, they border China. There's Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan is all in this area. The specific districts I worked in were primarily the city of Khorog in Badakhshan, and then in Shugnan, Afghanistan, Ishkashim, Afghanistan, and then on the Wakhan corridor up to Sarhada Brugel. I also worked a little in Morgab. I spent about 6 years on and off along the border doing field work. And prior to that, I actually spent a couple decades reading about the region. But even with that, I feel like I'm still a novice and still learning. There's just so much to learn. So I have one main concept that my book engages, which is informal organizations. And then what I do is I look at the role informal organizations play in terms of the state and the state-making process, civil society and civil society organizations, kinship networks, and then how informal organizations function when these things are not actually working fully. So first of all, informal organizations simply are organizations that have their own rules, their own norms, their own activities that they engage in that are not an official arm of the state, that are not sanctioned by the state, and therefore they are functioning independently from the state. But they do have these agreed upon sets of rules and missions, basically, as to what they are trying to do. I consider the state very simply in terms of a territory with clear borders, a monopoly of the use of force, and a monopoly over the economy or means of coercion. Civil society is a very unwieldy term. So sometimes it's important in this research to look at also what it is not. In my research, civil society is often conflated with civil society organizations. And civil society organizations in Tajikistan are largely co-opted by the state, so they're more of an arm of authoritarian reach. And in Afghanistan, they are largely co-opted by territorial kinship networks or powerful groups, and become closed and not open to the larger community. So I define civil society as the people living within a state that function independently of the state, as a community. And in both Afghanistan and Tajikistan, there's limited independence as such. Define kinship networks not just as familial groups. I borrow from several scholars. Both Collins and Shahs talk about fictive ties. So there's both familial blood networks, but there's also land and property, there's businesses, ethnicity, there's territory, there's powerful networks, and they all form these different kinship networks. So in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, the state, civil society, and kinship networks all kind of fail to provide people with access to lobbying for resources, a voice in government or governance, sometimes civic participation. And so it is in those places that informal organizations fill those gaps. They provide a buffer and a conduit for people to gain access to resources, to governance, and they also, as opposed to closed networks, they're often more open networks, not always, that allow a broader, more diverse group of people into the organization. Not always, though. So in my book, I have 8 case studies, and each is a different informal organization. They all exemplify organizations that are not state sanctioned and that have a very particular mission. And almost all of them do transcend various closed groups. Examples in my book are mahallas, which are neighborhood organizations. On the Tajik side of the border, they are not. In Harop, the neighborhood leaders are not sanctioned by the government. I also look at Shahs on the Afghan side. I look at women's groups, trafficking networks, development organizations, in particular, the Aga Khan Development Network institutions, the international community and its engagement with informal organizations. For example, the women's groups I look at, that looks pretty amorphous, but the chapter, the case in my book is on Afghan female governance. And prior to the Taliban takeover, the women actually in Shugnan and in Ishkashim were, in Shugnan district, the women had their own shura councils, which are village councils. And some of them were also involved in the district shura councils. And in Ishkashim, the women and men actually were in councils together. And in the Wakhan, over time, there had been 3 women that were allowed into the shura councils. On top of that, the women have formed pretty complex and connected networks to get things done, whether that's to mediate a water conflict with a neighbor, or to get education for themselves or their children, or basic access to food, medicine. And these informal organizations are women, how women in these very hierarchical and patriarchal societies have gained a voice. I know with the Taliban that is going to be radically different, but that said, I think that these informal organizations that they have formed and that were formed even more strongly over the past 20 years in some places, will continue. So one case that's integral to particularly the Tajik side of the border is a conflict that occurred on May 21st, 2014. This conflict, 3 days before the conflict, I met with 3 local leaders, Faride Manawar and their deputy, Sabir. And they told me, I interviewed them about leadership. Manawar and Faride were largely in charge of what they kind of controlled what came in and out of Harok in terms of trade, illicit and legal trade. And I asked them about that, and they said, well, you know, we're leaders for our community, and we cannot enrich ourselves. We have to enrich our community. And if we are corrupt in any way, our community will no longer support us. Which I thought was interesting. Sadly, 3 days later, the government called them to the police headquarters. There had already been some tension going on, and one of Sabir was shot and killed, and Faride and Manawar were also shot. Faride did die later in the hospital, and Manawar was taken to Moscow. And when that happened, the youth that these 2 men supported, because they funded many of the sports and community centers in the city, they reacted, and they protested, and they burnt 3 government buildings in the downtown area, including the prosecutor's office. And the government was going to react. And instead, the civil society leaders and other leaders in the community came together and spoke with the youth and convinced them to pitch tents in the main square, which is what happened. And so there are 17 mahallas in, or some say 18, but 17 mahallas in Harok. And this is a breakdown of the different mahallas. So each mahalla, there were 11 mahallas that pitched tents for 12 days in the main square in protest to the killings. After the 12 days, the local leaders negotiated with the government for a resolution and an agreement, and they asked the youth to peacefully disband, and they did. The government, in the end, did not follow through on its parts of the agreement, but there was no bloodshed, and the peace was largely kept. There were a few other incidents, but they were minor compared to this one. The Harok English Preparatory Program, where I volunteered over several years and taught English and research design, was a program that was a postgraduate program, but it was more than that. It was also a place where civil society leaders met with other community members to figure out what to do in the community in times of crisis. And it became a really important community center for the entire city. And during the conflict, it was a place where the leaders communicated a lot with the local scholars and academics as well, but also with each other in order to figure out how to peacefully negotiate with the Tajik government. In 2015, the government of Tajikistan shut it down because they did view it as a threat to their authoritarian government. And it silenced a key informal organization. KEP was never registered with the state of Tajikistan, so it remained an informal organization until it closed. On the Afghan side of the border, there's also a way in which the local leaders and informal organizations have decreased the potential for bloodshed after the Taliban takeover. One of the groups, at least in the Wakhan corridor, that did that, or leaders, were the Shahs. And the Shahs have been in the region since, allegedly since the 11th century, when Ismailism came to the region. And they were called peers before, then they became Shahs. They were appointed by the Aga Khan himself to be representatives of him. They did, at some point in the 90s, the Aga Khan was able to visit the area again and decided that the Shahs were no longer needed, so they were no longer his official representatives, and he appointed Khalifas. And then later he appointed Mulkis. And so the Ismaili Council does that now. But the Shahs are still there, and because the families have had so much power for so long that they have built up not only wealth, but also, I'd say, legitimate authority in the communities. And while it is imperfect, they do provide entry points for people to come to negotiate issues, and they connect the larger community. When the Taliban arrived in the Wakhan, they came with allegedly 4, I was sent this video that Bilal Sarwar posted on Twitter. They came with 4 cars into the Wakhan corridor. And if you see the picture here on the right, this is one of the Shahs shaking the hand with the Taliban. The Wakis were all cheering the Taliban, which was very misleading. This was on July 4th when they arrived, and the irony is not lost on any of us, I'm sure, that they tried to make it look like the Taliban were liberating the Wakis. The Wakis were told by the Shah to pretend to be happy that they arrived, as far as I'm told, by numerous people there, and that they did that in order to avoid bloodshed. So currently, the Shahs are also continuing, along with other local leaders, to negotiate things such as girls' education and opening education again, security in the area, and access to other social welfare programs. So they have played an important role. In the funnel analysis, and I know this is a quick overview, but my 8 case studies showed that when informal organizations are disrupted, destroyed, or co-opted, they actually create instability, because they are the connective tissue, or what I say here, the fascial system of the state that provides the glue, particularly the glue that holds a weak state together. Thank you for coming, and that is the end of my talk. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Great. Well, we already started receiving questions, which is wonderful. But first, let's go to Dr. Murtazashvili. Jen, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And Suzanne, just what incredible work. And it's just such an honor to be here and to share this and to celebrate this with you. I just have nothing but praise and just some questions for you and for, just questions that I have, and then also sort of future trajectories about where you're going to take this and what this tells us about what has happened in both Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and then thinking about how we can unite the study of this region much more. Because I want to say, first and foremost, to everyone, what this book does is something that I think many of us have tried to do, but not succeeded. And this is where, Suzanne, you just deserve so much credit for really breaking down these barriers of the Soviet Union. So much of our area studies paradigm of Central Asia is defined by these colonial borders or imperial boundaries. And as
No. Lost the connection. Let's keep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll keep it brief, but apologies, I'm in Georgia, I have a terrible connection. But breaking down these boundaries between this part of the world that should be studied as one. But when I started looking at Afghanistan, I was trained as a former Sovietologist. And when I started looking at Afghanistan, it became very, very difficult for me to do this. I think I'm still having a connection problem, so I'm going to turn my video off. Maybe this will make it easier. I'm turning my video off. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to keep the video off and hopefully we make it through it this way. But so this is an impossible thing to do. And I think that sometimes as scholars, we keep these old paradigms alive through our training. And so that's why it's really wonderful to have Ambassador Finn here, because he's someone who's really broken through those barriers in terms of looking at this region as Central Eurasia. And by doing this cross-boundary, cross-border work, Suzanne, your book actually allows us to take two countries that are studied so differently. And if you were to study them in universities, there are very few places where you get such an in-depth training on Afghanistan and also get such a training on Tajikistan. So I think,
Jennifer, I'm so grateful you're here, even with this.
I don't know what to say, but I've never seen flickering internet. But just one lesson is that there are so many attempts by political leaders to undermine these informal organizations. And I think one of the great tragedies of Afghanistan was the effort that both the international community sort of unwittingly, but the government very directly, the effort they put to undermine informal organizations because they saw informal organizations as a threat to the state. And they saw this in zero-sum terms rather than positive-sum terms. And I think there's huge lessons here for how we think about state formation. And sadly, state building efforts see the effort to build the state must come at the expense of social organizations. Traditional society is strong, therefore it must be undermined, therefore it must be against the state. Political leaders believe that to be the case. The Taliban has believed that to be the case. So in so many communities throughout Afghanistan, the first thing the Taliban do is they shoot the equivalent of the Shahs, right? In many different communities, because they understand that these are legitimate sources of power that can undermine their ability to gain control of areas. So the way that you weave through kinship and clan, I think there's really important lessons for the way people are using the term clan right now today when people are talking about Kazakhstan. And if people were to read your book, they would use this term much more carefully. The book also does a beautiful job of reconstructing those violent days in May 2014 in Tajikistan, in Khorog. And I would encourage everyone who's interested in instability in Tajikistan and understanding those dynamics of political violence and local mobilization to take a look at how you've beautifully captured that through your own time in those communities at that region. And then finally, the book touches on so many issues: the international community, aid, the political economy of aid. You've got Russia in there, you've got China, you've got the US, you've got the Aga Khans, you've got geopolitics. There's so many things in this book for so many different audiences. And I think the only question I have, and this is just, it's not a critique, it's just my curiosity, is seeing continuities across the border, is that the case studies that you have well, I've almost made it through, I think. But looking at case studies across the border, you have a few in there, but seeing the continuities of custom and tradition, they look very different on the different sides of the borders. How would you connect those two? How would you connect them historically? And I think I'm going to leave it there because I don't trust my internet connection. But congratulations, Suzanne. It was a real honor and a pleasure to be here. And it's been so thrilling to see how your work has evolved.
Thank you so much. I'm deeply honored.
Thank you so much, Jen, from me as well, for so impeccably keeping the narrative despite the disruptions, the connection. So let's first go to Ambassador Finn, and then we'll go to Jen's questions and other questions. Yes, Ambassador Finn.
Good. Thank you, ladies. It's a pleasure to be here. And Jennifer, I'm 100% sympathetic to you because of the internet. Because for the past almost 2 years, I was at my house in Turkey, where I faced these problems every time I tried to do anything on the internet. So I know how exasperating this must have been for you. I'll start by the only time I was able to get to Badakhshan in my 3 years as ambassador, because of security, because of weather, because of the myriad problems, was a trip I took where I had to go from Almaty, where the American government made me live because they were afraid of security concerns in Tajikistan, which I believe came because of the attacks of the embassies in Africa. Welcome to the world of diplomacy. But anyhow, I arrived then, not from Dushanbe, but I arrived coming down from Almaty. And when we got outside of Murgab, being a diplomat, I knew what to do, and I had dressed up with my suit and tie, to the puzzlement of my guards. They said there's nobody out there but, yaks and marmots. And we arrived outside of Murgab, and we were met by a delegation on the road of local officials, including the intelligence chief of the bureau wearing a little white hunter outfit, and beautiful ladies with velvet gowns and caps with feathers on them. And they were carrying a large sign, which ironically was very accurate, and it said, "Welcome, dear quests," not guests. So I said, okay, I know what they want. Where's my wallet? Anyway, then I came down to the beautiful valleys and spent some time in Badakhshan and went out to Ishkashim. So I, at least, I'm a little bit familiar with the area. And a lot of what Jennifer said, excuse my voice, is really very important. The lines on the maps they're things that we draw for our own convenience. And I taught for a number of years at Princeton. I was teaching seminars about Central Asia as well as Turkish literature. And I always started by talking about the geography and how Alexander the Great started out with his army marching east. And he kept going, conquering city after city, empire after empire, as you know. And he only stopped when he came down into the Ganges plain in Pakistan, because the troops didn't recognize it anymore. Because the geography, all the way from, you can start in Spain and go all the way across, you had the same complex of mountains and valleys and rivers. It's all very familiar, even though they don't market olives in Pakistan. There are wild olive trees all over the place. So this was the world that they knew, this lateral band. And that was their world. And lines on the maps didn't mean anything for them. Just as today, the line on the map between Afghanistan and Pakistan doesn't mean anything for the Afghans, as they've told me many times. President Karzai said to me so many times, when we go there, we're not going to a foreign country. When they come here, they're coming to a foreign country. So these concepts and ideas are things that we put in our own minds to deal with our own agendas. And it's very important to try to get beyond that. In a way, as Americans, we're lucky because we all live in multiple realities in America. You have your ethnic reality and your geographical reality and your fiduciary reality and your political reality, and your family is all mixed up with religions and everything else. This is America. We're all very familiar with that. So for these people in this lovely little microcosm of the world who have to deal with many different realities at the same time, it's something that we intuitively can understand in a way that people who live in other places might not. I remember when my wife is also a diplomat, and she was in Frankfurt at one point, and they were closing the American base, and they wanted to move all the local employees 40 kilometers away to Wiesbaden. And they said, we could never move to Wiesbaden. We've always lived here, you know, because that was their reality. So we had to try to deal with other people's realities, and we bring lots of problems with us when we come to this part of the world and impose them on the people, as Jennifer pointed out, by seeing things through the eyeglasses of our organizational structures and expectations. And we're seeing some of the results of that in Afghanistan, where we thought we were going to, you know, they were all going to turn out to be Democrats tomorrow. But we also have the other side. So we have to deal with all of those things. As Jennifer said, and anyone who reads the book will say, it's a marvelous, incredibly intensive work. I have nothing but respect and pride in you for doing this. You never mentioned the danger part, but since many people were killed during the course of the book, the danger part was quite clear. And you're a very brave woman, and you're brave because you weren't afraid. It didn't occur to you to be afraid. You just simply were there doing your job. And it's a tribute to your personality that you were able to do your job, and that people spoke to you and dealt with you. So my hat's off to you. And also, on your intellectual side, the bibliography was incredibly impressive, and I always read through every bibliography to see who's there and who isn't there. I recognized a lot of old friends, so very good on that point. I have more questions than answers, but you pointed out that that's what your book does. It raises more questions than answers, and I don't have any problems. But you know, reading it, I'm somewhat more familiar than I guess most people with the area and the problems. I think it could have used a little bit more explanation. And I have just, even now, I'm always writing down new things. When you're talking about the ladies, I said, what would be the relationship between the Ismaili woman and the Sunni woman? You mentioned how in Ish Kashim, they're starting to wear burqas, which I found trist, because I went there, and I think it was 2000. I remember we arrived about 11 o'clock in the morning, and they immediately had a huge party with people dancing and alcohol and women wearing their great clothes. And I said, well, this is Shangri-La. What a beautiful, beautiful place. And sad to see that that is changing. But of course, that was a special time when I was there, because it was just at the end of the Civil War. There's still lots of violence going on, but it was basically over. The government was just beginning to get on its feet and set itself up. And you pointed out many, many things that have happened since then and is still happening. At that time, there was a kind of a hiatus, which is why KEEP is able to set itself up in that way as an independent organization. I recall other things that were done at the time. The government wasn't able to manifest itself in every aspect of society, in every part of the country. So there were lots of things that were starting to happen in terms of civil society and freedom of the press. And you know, we wondered where it was going to go, and not surprisingly, it went in the direction that it has gone. So we see that, and all the conflicts that you're talking about in Nagorno-Karabakh are part and parcel of that, of a regrouping because of a change in political circumstances. You could do a whole separate study on the Aga Khan, who, as you said, was finally able to come back. Well, during the years of the Soviet Union, he was not able to come back. And so the Ismailis there regrouped within their own communities and set up their own norms. And he came back and he said, well, wait a minute, you know, I'm the guy, I'm the Aga Khan, and started to change things. And I see and of course he worked with the government of Tajikistan, and you pointed that out in ways that we may say, well, you know, here we go again. And that's true too, but also, you know, on that level, you have to, as someone like that, as any kind of organization, you have to make some changes in modalities in order to be able to do what you want to do. I mean, diplomacy is the art of compromise. And I can assure you I've agreed to many things that I didn't think were so great in order to get things done that were imperative. That's what happens. And actually in a diplomatic agreement, both sides should be a little bit unhappy at the end. That means it's working or will work. Because if one side, Germany after World War I, one side loses, the other side wins, that's a prescription for trouble down the road. So that's what's going on there. And the evolution that's taking place in the area, of course, is taking place over the tops of all these people. The government of Tajikistan is coming in, you point in, they're bringing in their own people. And that was one of my questions, you know, how are they trying or not trying to integrate the people of Badakhshan into the government structures? You know, just killing them isn't really an answer in the long run. It's going to lead to further problems. And you pointed out very, very interestingly for me, because I do follow these things and I had not heard it, that a small incipient movement to try to pull Badakhshan away from Tajikistan and attach it to Russia, as I'm sure you all know, they have done in a number of other cases, most particularly in Georgia, in 3 different instances, in Moldova, in Azerbaijan, Armenia. This is a Russian policy to, you know, set up to capitalize on the problems that they set up in the beginning and use them for their own purposes. So I don't think we've heard the last of the Russians making some motions in Badakhshan. The other area that I wish there had been more of in the book is, what are the Chinese doing? You know, you pointed out that there was in one of the clashes, the weapons were supplied by China. Oh, I said, you know, the Chinese now have 2 military establishments in the area, as you pointed out. When I was in Dushanbe, they were just coming in, they were starting to build the road to China, and the Tajik Swazi said, couldn't we have it go only one way? And now they're saying there were no Chinese in Dushanbe at that point, but now there's a Chinese community there. And they built, it was like 10 years in Tibet, they built this huge embassy on the main avenue in Dushanbe. And I said, oh, look out, you know, change is on its way, especially because, as I'm sure most of you know, China had troops there in the 19th century that were pushed out by the Russians and to a little bit by the English. And that means that they think they can come back. You know, China's always nibbling away at its borders. And so I would look for trouble down the road there, especially since Tajikistan is so poor. And who's going to give it money? You pointed, the Americans have left. You pointed out the diminishing of American funding in Tajikistan from pathetic to truly pathetic. So someone's going to give them money. Who is it? And that's the bottom line. Why is all of this conflict going on in Tajikistan? Why are people stealing all the funds and fighting with one another? Because they're desperately poor. And that information probably isn't available, but income levels and the number of people forced to go work abroad, that could also be helpful for understanding what's going to happen in Tajikistan down the road, because it does come down to economics, because people are going to live. So these are some of the ongoing problems there. Another thing that I just because me would be more interested in is is how ethnic breakdown, which you talk about, of course, and kinship issues are reflected in the actual organization of people in the informal groups and their contacts with the more formal groups, which you allude to many, many times. And I don't think you had the access or the resources to do the kind of in-depth surveys that would give us all those charts and graphs that everybody likes to look at. You're very much, this is a first-hand, at-home kind of study, and wonderful for that, because you were there and you paint this little world, and you were lucky in that, because you were in this tiny valley, this tiny place, basically cut off from other things, so you could see all kinds of things that would be interfered with were you in a place that was more plugged in to the rest of the world. So you had the advantage of that, and also the disadvantage. You were in a beautiful little Oriental miniature, and so you were able to look at all the pieces and the colors and things, and that's a lovely thing. And I do hope that you take this further, because this kind of study could be applicable to other places, because of those very constraints. You know, like a scientific experiment, you don't have a lot of the other things that intrude. You pointed to, again, to my surprise, at how some of the people who made this money were able to send their children to university in Europe and the United States. So that money was there, but I'm sure there was numbers of people, not crowds of people, a very small thing. And what are the other people doing? You know, the educational levels in Badakhshan. The Ismailis, as we know, fostered sexual equality and gender equality, and also education. And how about the other people there? What are their educational levels and expectations? What is the government of Tajikistan doing? The problems arising from the civil war, where, as you pointed out, the Ismailis were managed to infiltrate themselves, were infiltrated into the intelligence apparatus, following the good old British adage of find some minority and put them in charge of the other people and make everybody hate them, and then they'll be loyal to you. It works very well. And they did that, but after the Civil War was ended, during the Civil War and afterwards, perhaps they're paying the price, and that might be part of the explanation of why the government of Tajikistan is acting the way it was. One gets the impression of more of an occupying power than a participating government. You know, and that was another thing that struck me as I was reading it. For my sins, I've been in many.
Ambassador Finn, we're running out of time. If you can make it really, really short.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, I've been in many situations where we had civil strife and displaced people, and I know I've lost my track. But anyway, I was just wondering how you allude to some other studies of similar situations. For my edification, as someone who is not in the field, it would be useful to know more about that and be able to compare them more. In Tajikistan, you talk about Khatlon and Khojan, but they have different bases for their things. So it would be nice to have more of a comparison. So, I'll end it there. But it was a wonderful work, and I hope it will lead to many, many more.
Thank you so much. Susie, why don't we go to you for quickly addressing? I'm very sorry.
No, I understand. It's fine.
The feedback from Dr. Murtazashvili and Ambassador Finn, and then maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions from the audience.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for your feedback. I didn't expect the positive feedback, and I really appreciate it. I also appreciate the questions from both of you. I'm going to try to address them really quickly. So first of all, you asked me, Jen, how would I connect those histories together? As a matter of fact, I've written a chapter called Breaks That Bind, and it's all about that. It's all about the connections in the history, and it's going to be part of a Routledge edited volume on Tajikistan and the Pamirs. So I'm excited, and I'm happy to send that to you. But I did go into detail, but it is a fascinating history to connect, because there are so many connections. but that isn't really in the book. I think that's very true. I mean, it is sort of implicitly, but not explicitly. Thank you again. To your questions, Ambassador Finn, I'm going to say with the Sunni and Shia women, I spent time with both of them in the same room in 2009, 10, 11, 13, and by 13 it was less so. So, you know, the women were kind of throwing the burqa over whenever they saw anybody who was Sunni in Ishkashim. And then by 2015, they were all wearing the burqa almost all the time. And I was, you know, in the bizarre sort of spit under people's breath, go home, you American, in Dari. So it became a much more intense place very quickly, actually. And that is, I believe, because the Taliban shadow governments were there pretty strongly, and also the drug trafficking had recruited many young people. They would offer heroin for cheaper than opium, and then due to Afghan heroin being twice as strong as any other heroin in the world, people just couldn't get off of it. So it was extremely exploitive of youth, and it spread like a virus. It was tragic to watch. The question about the Chinese, yeah, the Chinese supposedly are building a base in Ishkashim. There's lots of activity going on. I was tracking some of even their communication network infrastructure that they were putting in, that they're now putting in Khorog as well to help the Tajik government monitor the entire area. And the Khorogis are very scared that it's going to be like the Uyghur population with facial recognition, because it's all funded and put in by China. They have the base they have two bases on the Afghan side. They have the base in Morghab, and supposedly they are rotating with the Chinese, Tajik and Afghan soldiers at the border, but I think maybe not the Afghans now that there's some strife. And there's lots more to say about China. I just don't feel like an expert in that area, so I didn't write a lot about it, because, you know, Erna Hoffman, for example, there's a few other scholars that just know so much more than I will. I do think this study applies to many other places. In my book, in the preface, I write a little bit about how it pertains to the US right now. And I am working on an article looking at things like how environmental networks have, someone gave me this idea, which I think is a good one, a friend of mine, Melissa Welsh, that the environmental networks are becoming informal organizations that need to transcend the state, because the states aren't doing what they need to do. And then you have, you know, people like the Proud Boys or Tea Party or whatever, which, you know, there's a dark side to informal organizations, and what's that about? So I'm going to try to write something about that, which pertains to here. Lastly, the integrating of the Badakhshanis into the structures, that's just not happening. No, I mean, it is if you're, you know, well, that's not necessarily true, because there's some that are tied to the KGB that spy on this. I mean, you know, there's this tension. So that's a complicated question. But in general, they were supposed to be integrating them into the security forces, and that didn't really happen. What they did was they used the Russian technique and used them, because there's also minorities and majorities in Badakhshan within the Ismaili. So they would bring in those from Vanj or Darvaz or whatever that were not actually connected to the community, and then put them in there so they would spy on them. So you know, it's complicated. Migrant labor is really important. And I think the other question, which I'm not going to address, but it is a really important aspect, particularly since in Russia right now, there's a Pamiri group that has been protesting in Moscow because there's a conflict going on in Khorog between the government and the locals over the killing of a young man. And there's a leader in Moscow who's from Roshkola, which is a neighboring district, that was allegedly kidnapped, but he was leading the Pamiris there. And there are a lot of migrant labor there, and they actually have a lot of power from Moscow. And so I think Russia sometimes uses them to keep Tajikistan in their place, so to speak, and sometimes then disappears some people. But that's speculation. Lastly, the Tajik education versus the Ismaili education. I think that Tajik education has gone way downhill when it, right at the end of the Soviet Union, we all knew that Tajikistan had something like a 90-something% literacy rate. That's no longer the case. And I do think that is causing some of the youth to look for other less desirable avenues to engage themselves. And I think that's a problem in Tajikistan, because you're right, that the people are incredibly impoverished. And as the glacial melts and the water shortages happen, and they share land with China and they do this and that, and the rivers, the Badakhshan river valley is not that robust, and the Aral Sea is drying up. It's going to be a much bigger problem. Hunger already is causing stunting and whatnot throughout the area, and the land has extremely high salinization throughout the farmlands. And many of the farmers talk to me about that their land is not growing like it used to. So
thank you.
I could go on and on.
Yes. And it's amazing how much is happening in this little microcosm that you've been studying, how it's connected to all these other big issues and trends. Let's go a little bit over time since we started slightly late. Let me give you 3-4 questions for quick answers. One question: would it be correct to think of informal organizations as a type of polycentric governance, as discussed by late Eleanor Ostrom? Then there is a question from, do you want to take notes? From Ambassador Kroll, who asks you to comment on what, if any, effect the social system influence has had on society in both Tajikistan and Afghanistan, which had both been subjects of Soviet rule, albeit for a shorter period of time in Afghanistan. Then there was a question on blockage of internet in Gorno Badakhshan, autonomous oblast, and I will actually, let me add to that. What is the role of internet and social media in the informal organizations you've been studying? If you have any thoughts on that. And the last one, let's take this one. It's a shorter one, that's why I go for it. Are there informal organizations that the Chinese find more attractive to work with? What do you see as their objective?
China's objective? Whose objective?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay. I will start. Polycentric governance. Yeah, I do. I think in my book, I look at Twilight Institution. I have different concepts from different scholars, not all who I will cite here, but the concepts are Twilight institutions, the mediated state. Jen has communal governance structures. And they all, I do think, I don't know, I have read Ostrom quite a bit, but I don't know the polycentric governance concept, but I could imagine that it would be similar. What I look at, how I understand informal organizations is that they actually make the state. And so without them, you really don't have a state. And so when we destroy them, we're destroying the very thing that is making a state run, because they exist everywhere. They're just ubiquitous.
Suzanne, I'll jump in here. I'm going to say you don't address Ostrom stuff in this way straight on, but I would say by reading your work that yes, you believe that this is polycentric. That could be a paper to write. I see another paper there, but this is definitely polycentric order because you have the informal order at the bottom and then multiple layers at the top and this intersection between the formal and the informal, and that would make polycentric.
Well, I feel bad that I've missed, an important, amazing scholar that actually is explaining something I'm trying to explain. But thank you, Jen.
But you did much. We don't have to do everything in one book. That's for the next.
That's the next. Thank you. Okay. The other question, so George Kroll's question about the systems, I think from what I understood, that question is the influence of the Soviet Union's colonialism in both Tajikistan and Afghanistan and the difference between the two. Oh, that's such an interesting question. I wrote a little bit about that in my last book. So in Tajikistan, since they were completely under the Soviet Union, whereas the entire time the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, it was at war for control. There are, it's almost like in Tajikistan, there's a web of Soviet policy, influence, infrastructure that sort of is woven into everything. But then there's also the informal groups, the way the governance is now, the sort of assertion of different identities that were able to come more forward after that structure wasn't quite as oppressive. On the Afghan side, you have more like fingerprints versus a web. And so you see it, like there were these political parties, the Suzoi and the Barchani and the Khalki, which don't exist anymore, but in Badakhshan, they're an integral part of daily conversation. Like I had one of my research associates, he had to take me to every Suzoi party member's house to have a discussion politically about the Suzois. But you go to Kabul and that just doesn't exist that much. The Khalki network, which is a party that formed during the Soviet Union, it's a transnational network. I asked a guy, so if the Khalkis were to take over the government, I asked him in 2015, who would it be? Like, who would be the leaders? And he started, oh, this guy in Germany and this guy in Turkey and this guy, and he listed the entire network. So that's a pretty important aspect of sort of the way in which people view and still want some form of Soviet influence there. I was yelled at in a bazaar by a former Afghan general for the Soviets. And you guys come here and destroy our country. The Soviets were building it up. They were making it beautiful. He's screaming and screaming at me in the bazaar, and I'm thinking, whoa, and this older man. And then when he was done screaming, he invited me to meet his family and said, you actually seem okay. Why don't you come? We can discuss it. It's very different though, because it's not woven. If that answers that question, I'm sorry if it's not very thorough. The other question was the blockage of the internet in Jibal. I believe it's still blocked. So when the government of Tajikistan with the local leaders made an agreement for the protesters who the government had been shooting November 28th to disband. And the agreement was that they would restore internet, that they would investigate the killing of this young man that happened in Roshkala, and that they would not arrest or issue arrest warrants for any of the protesters or their leaders. So, last week they issued arrest warrants for 9 of the local leaders. They have not restored internet as far as I know. They have experimented with blocking phones, and they have also now issued arrest warrants for the lawyer who was heading up the civil society group that negotiated with the government. So there are reprisals, and they have made threats that if these leaders do not turn themselves in, they will take them by force. I do understand from some reports that some US senators have talked to the US Tajik ambassador that, I think this is, from what I understand, this is public, that we do not support, they do not support a military incursion in Kharok to take these leaders. And if they did take these leaders, there would be, the Kharokis are preparing for conflict, which brings me to the role of internet and social media in the informal organization. So I write a little bit about that in the chapter on the international community, but the way that, currently with this struggle, they use internet, social media, and letter writing as a way to influence the international community. And it is also used as a way to get funding for the things they want funded versus what the Tajik government wants funded. And they influence very, very well different international networks all the way through to our senators. They also have some ear in Russia. They have less ears, so to speak, in China, because the Tajik government has more ears. So I don't actually think they're reaching China that well. Yeah, I think does that answer that question okay? And then the last one is, are there informal organizations that China engages with? And yes, so for example, one of the Shahs on the Tajik side, the Chinese started offering scholarships to their sons almost a decade ago. So they started cultivating the children of the local leaders a long time ago. And on the Tajik side, I think they're so, they're interwoven with the government, but they also, they've had a very complex, Erna Hoffman just wrote about this actually, it's really thorough, but the interplay between the government and the business elite is, it's really enmeshed. And the Tajik government's amount of debt that they owe China at the moment means that there's all kinds of other layers of enmeshment. But I don't know enough about the specific informal organizations that they interact with, but I think from what I've read, they have used them to their advantage. I do think that there are many people currently in Tajikistan who are scared that China is going to promote what they're doing with the Uyghurs to minority groups in Tajikistan. And there's really a lot of fear about that. And there's also a lot of fear there about what's going on in Kazakhstan and bringing in the Russian troops and those kinds of partnerships. So I think that answered the questions.
Thank you so much. It's amazing how much ground we've managed to cover in 1 hour. And let me thank you again for this rich and very thought-provoking book that you've written. And let me remind the viewers that you can buy it. And using the code, you'll have a 30% discount. And the secret code is UMF, capital UMF 21. And you can see it in our chat. Yes.
Can I say one last thing, which I forgot to say up front, and I really apologize for this. I want to thank the people of Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and the Pamiris in particular, because it was their willingness to share their lives with me that made this happen. And I'm deeply indebted to them in a way. And also I made very many close friends. So, and thank you so much, Narges and Jennifer and Robert. So grateful for this.
Well, you did it. I wanted also to thank our excellent, wonderful discussants, Dr. Murtazashvili, Ambassador Finn, and thank the audiences. And I think some of them are people from Tajikistan, so you actually address them directly. And let me also thank my colleagues here at the Davis Center, Chris Martin and Laura Sargent, for helping us to do this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the center. Yeah, absolutely. And to you, Narges.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.